case you need it.
And you'll receive your check for the introduction. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, and nowhere near enough time to do it. So I'll go as quickly as I can, but I'm going to be talking about my experiences working in two very, very complex political organizations, the United States Senate and the Department and then Office for Disarmament Affairs and the Secretary of the UN. I'd like to begin by giving you a little bit of a legal and political context, because the words that I've been working with for so many years have meaning only within the contexts in which they're used. And the first context that I'd like to talk about is the context of U.S. policy. And then I'd like to turn a little bit to the way that the UN has treated this issue, and then get into some really nitty-gritty details on the language itself. Disarmament is not terribly a popular subject these days in the United States, because largely there's not much understanding of what it means or what it encompasses, or what the legacy is of our country's commitment to this goal. It was the United States that launched the first program to put under international ownership all nuclear materials and facilities in a plan called the Baruch Plan, offered in June 1946. One of the most eloquent statements of a proposal for what was called general and complete disarmament came in September 25th, 1961, with a great speech by John Kennedy in the General Assembly. This speech I really commend it to you. It was one of these gems written by Sorensen and other of the Kennedy speechwriters, but it really soars with very inspirational language about the importance of disarmament, but more importantly about how disarmament is in the security interests of the United States. So it's not something that is a philanthropic act, it's something that is actually in the practical and realistic interests of the country. He said, for example, for 15 years now, this was in 1961, this organization has sought the reduction and destruction of arms. Now that goal is no longer a dream. It's a practical matter of life and death. The risks inherent in disarmament pale in comparison to the risks inherent in an unlimited arms race. Now this idea of pursuing the comprehensive elimination of weapons was predominant in the 60s and 70s, I'm sorry, in the 50s and 60s, but by the mid-1960s, it started to give way to another approach, which was called partial measures, which was a focus less on single big treaties than on stepping stone agreements toward the goal of zero, getting rid of these nuclear weapons. And so we looked along in the 60s and 70s and 80s with these partial measures, things like regional nuclear weapon-free zones, things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and other such agreements. But never quite getting the kind of progress that people wanted to see towards zero. Things changed rather rapidly in January of 1907 with the publication of a series of op-eds written by four old Cold War hawks, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and William Perry. They began a series of op-eds about the need for the country to start taking more seriously its commitments on disarmament. They said, for example, in their op-ed of January 07, without the bold vision, actions will not be perceived as fair or urgent. And without actions, the vision will not be perceived as realistic or possible. So they really did put disarmament back on the map again, in the sense of making it politically correct to talk about it again. And of course, this happened in April 5th of 2009. President Obama made his speech in Prague, which also did a lot to restore, to rebirth the concept of disarmament. He said the United States would be seeking the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. And I always point out that he didn't say seeking peace and security so that we can have a world without nuclear weapons. He said seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. Quite a different expression. He did, however, also say that as long as nuclear weapons exist anywhere else, we have to have them. And that we also have a responsibility to protect our allies with nuclear weapons. So there's some contradictions in that statement, which I think you'll come back to see later. The American Nuclear Posture Review, which sets out the doctrine of U.S. nuclear policy, also has this ambiguity built in it. It talks about the aim of getting rid of nuclear weapons, but it also refers to nuclear weapons as essential, affirming the value of nuclear deterrence, affirming the value of using nuclear weapons to defend allies, affirming the value of deploying nuclear weapons abroad, and also the need to maintain such weapons on high alert. Yet the same posture statement also said there would be no new nuclear weapons being developed, no new warheads, and no new missions or capabilities. Recently, the administration also announced a huge $180 billion plan to modernize the nuclear weapon complex, including $80 billion for the nuclear weapon labs and another $100 billion for nuclear weapon delivery systems. So it's really hard to kind of reconcile this kind of money being spent on weapons with the concept of disarmament. I'd like to remind you that in terms of law, the United States is committed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Article 6 of that treaty contains a binding legal obligation to pursue negotiations in good faith on nuclear disarmament. That treaty went into force in 1970. It's been around for 42 years, and such negotiations have never occurred. To this day, not one single nuclear weapon has been eliminated by a treaty commitment. The treaty commitments that have been included, like the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty and the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty, and most recently the New START Treaty, establish ceilings or thresholds on deployments of strategic nuclear weapons. They do not require the destruction of a single nuclear weapon. So we have a long, long way to go in this business of disarmament. Now, disarmament is, in fact, mentioned twice in the UN Charter, turning now to the international dimension. And the Charter was signed and concluded before the first bomb had ever been tested. No one knew about nuclear weapons, so there's no references to nuclear weapons in the Charter. But the General Assembly in January of '46, when it adopted its first General Assembly resolution, explicitly said that the goal here of disarmament is the physical elimination of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And later, the General Assembly clarified that disarmament also encompasses the limitation and regulation of conventional armaments. And together, these are pursued on a two-track effort, and the UN has been pursuing these goals simultaneously since 1947, unchanged. The concept that known in the United Nations for this dual goal of eliminating weapons of mass destruction and limiting and regulating conventional arms is called general and complete disarmament. Now, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, when it was concluded in 1968, entered into 1944 and 1970, the treaty became permanent through a special conference that took place in 1995, and as a term for making that treaty permanent, the states parties agreed on systematic and progressive efforts to reduce nuclear weapons globally with the ultimate goals of eliminating those weapons. In 2000, at another review conference of that treaty, the states parties agreed to 13 steps for the achievement of that goal, and most recently in 2010, another review conference of the treaty adopted a 64-point action plan for the practical measures to achieve these goals. And basically that provides the framework that orients our work at the UN. We have some additional items, like for example, in September of 2009, the Security Council held its first summit meeting ever on the issue of disarmament and non-proliferation. But their approach has been to focus on preconditions or conditions for the achievement of disarmament. And that is somewhat different from how the rest of the treaty law has advanced. Each year, there are about 50 General Assembly resolutions on disarmament issues. About half of them are on nuclear matters, and of those, they are always very divisive and subject to recorded votes. The final break in this architecture of the UN work in nuclear disarmament was a speech that I'm very pleased to have worked on in October of 2008, where the Secretary General outlined a 5-point nuclear disarmament proposal, focusing on specific nuclear weapon state actions and actions relating to the conclusion of the Nuclear Weapon Convention. He called for the United Nations Security Council to hold a summit on nuclear disarmament, which was later held a year later. We had emphasized the role of the rule of law, bringing the rule of law to disarmament by emphasizing the role of treaties. the need to complete existing treaties that have been signed but not ratified, the need to negotiate new treaties, and the need to bring existing treaties to full universal membership, the need for full accountability and transparency, and the need for complementary measures, including over regulating conventional arms, space weapons, and other type systems. Now, you may well wonder, well, I can't imagine anything more different than the Senate and the UN. But I'll tell you, there are a lot of similarities. A lot of them. Both of them are normative institutions. They work on trying to build a consensus around norms or standards to regulate behavior. They consist of institutions for deliberating, for establishing, and for maintaining norms. That's what they do. That's what the Senate does. That's what the UN does, just in a different level. In a strange way, they also have similar structures in the sense they're both highly decentralized. There's very little hierarchy within the Senate or within the UN. It's a very, very dispersed group of players in that institution. They are both fora, provide arenas for debate and deliberation. They provide an arena for accountability to hold states up to their commitments that they've made. They provide an arena for representation of interests, including the role of civil society and non-governmental organizations. And they provide a means for collective action through coalitions. One thing I learned in the Senate was you don't get anything done legislatively unless you can somehow find a way to work on a bipartisan basis. In the UN, similarly, you don't get resolutions done and adopted unless you can find a way to build networks and coalitions among different states and different actors with different interests. You've got to find a way to find that middle ground. And lastly, it's interesting that both the Senate and the UN have a form of a secretariat. There are professional staff members who are trained in a substantive area who tend to be there at a full-time professional basis. I'm a member of the Secretariat now of the UN, and our role is largely non-political. That doesn't mean we can't advocate. We are given mandates to advocate certain goals, certain standards and principles, but our duty is to serve our member states and the Secretary General by providing the best advice we can professionally to them. Now, the differences, of course, are quite clear. The players in the U.S. Senate are primarily seeking goals relating to national objectives rather than global objectives. They're working on more of a unilateral rather than multilateral framework. For example, when the Senate was considering the New START Treaty or the defense budget, for example, it has made insistent, really clear that any future arms reduction agreement with Russia should include no change at all of policy on missile defense, no change on space weapon capabilities, and no change on limiting U.S. conventional arms capabilities. So clearly there's a focus on specific, narrow national interests as the goal of that body. There's also a considerably more narrow scope of geographic participation, of representation. We have non-governmental and civil society groups coming into the Senate, but they're national in orientation. In the UN, we've got civil society elements coming from all over the world, religious groups, women's groups, environmentalists, human rights activists, from all over the world. And so there's geographic scope involved. The UN work tends to be more episodic. Our busiest times of year are October, November, when the first committee of the General Assembly meets. But the Senate is more kind of constantly active. There are no political parties in the UN. We don't have party discipline or party indiscipline, as you will. But instead, we have something functionally equivalent to that, which is a kind of networking or coalition building among states of like-minded interests that goes on. Clearly, in the UN, the major decisions are made not by us and the Secretariat, they're made by the states. So when there are disagreements or frustrations or inability of the UN to move forward, it's not due to some kind of intrinsic flaw in the UN as an institution, it's due to the simple fact that the states' policies and priorities differ. And when they differ, it's hard to get movement forward. Also, in the UN, we have to deal with the reality of sovereignty. You have to respect the sovereignty of each member state, not try to intervene in their internal affairs. And we also, at the UN, have far weaker oversight tools than they do in the Senate. We can't issue subpoenas. We don't hold hearings where we have people come in and justify their behavior and the like. We have no mandatory judicial review in the UN compared to the US. The International Court of Justice lacks exclusive jurisdiction. And the norms that are adopted at the UN are by and large political in nature rather than legal, with two exceptions. The exceptions being treaties that are negotiated through the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, which is a part of the adjunct body of the UN system, which is in charge of negotiating multilateral treaties. And also, decisions of the Security Council on issues of peace and security are regarded as binding among members. But aside from that, the other products that the UN produces are political in nature and they're not legally binding. So now, both, despite the differences and similarities, both institutions, I can assure you, attach enormous importance to words. They're like paints to an artist, like bricks to a mason, and like notes to a musician. The words are the instruments, the means by which to define the scope and the substance of obligations among states. And they are vigorously considered in the evolutionary process of developing these norms, and certainly no more so in the UN machinery. Now, there are some specific words that have been both problematic for me as well as open doors. And some of them are really quite amusing and how they've taken off. I remember when I was in the Senate and I first heard the term rogue nation or rogue state. I thought, well, that's interesting. What is a rogue state? Well, it turns out a rogue state means anything that you want it to be. It can be an excuse to limit the applicability of export controls, for example, because the exporters will argue that our export controls should target only goods going to rogue states and not anyone else. So who's a rogue state? Well, again, definitions vary. But the net effect of the phrase rogue state has been to orient U.S. export control and sanctions laws so that they apply only to a handful of countries, roughly 3, with laissez-faire basically the standard for other countries. And at one time when I was in the Senate, I prepared what was called a Devil's Dictionary of export control terms. See, even back then I was interested in words. And I tried to come up with what a definition of rogue state was, and all I could find was synonyms that have been used by others. Like, one of my favorites is Club Mad. Countries like Iraq. That's another famous one. But at any rate, I've tried to show in my speeches that I wrote for Senator Glenn that the rogue state concept is wildly distorting non-proliferation policy and its implementation. Because the problem of the spread of nuclear weapons in the world is not a problem limited to 3 countries. It's a problem that is fully global in scope. The most recent Pakistani scientist, Dr. A.Q. Khan, ran a nuclear supply network that spanned 3 continents, involving almost a dozen countries that were involved in this. So it's very, very difficult. You can see this has basically become what I call a meme that has turned into a rhetorical virus. It is really, it's a phrase that was probably cooked up originally by a speechwriter, but it's become essentially a policy. And so words can have profound impact on policy. Whenever you see the phrase, go into Google sometime and do a search on the phrase falling into the hands of, and then put weapon. You'll find millions of hits on that phrase, from academia to journalism to, it's completely off the scale in terms of whenever any discussion comes up of weapons of mass destruction, the greatest concern is that they are falling into the hands of who? Of terrorists, non-state actors, irresponsible states. The main point is not us. See, there's a difference between safe hands and responsible hands for these weapons of mass destruction and bad guys. And it's this kind of black and white, simplistic framing of the world that has, again, it's a phrase or a term that has had profound impact on the implementation of policy. Now, it doesn't, let's face it, I worked for Senator Glenn, and I knew that one of the key rules of getting things done is to be able to simplify. So we had our own little mottos and phrases that we used. Our Nuclear Proliferation Prevention Act of 1994 repeatedly used the phrase that Glenn in his speeches, he said, our goal of this legislation is to take the profits out of proliferation. And I remember a number of other of these phrases that came about. I remember during the debate on the U.S.-Japan Nuclear Cooperation Agreement in 1989, Glenn warned impassionately about the dangers of earthquakes in northern Japan to nuclear facilities. They were sitting at the time on the Ring of Fire. Take a look at Glenn's speech on 21 March 88, and you'll see that we had some warnings there that we were unfortunately not very well heeded. I found something very strange. I found it curious that for the last 30 years, pundits have been warning of at least 20 countries that are seeking weapons of mass destruction, and the threat is always growing. Now think about that. For 30 years, we've been saying there's always 20 countries that are seeking weapons of mass destruction, and 30 years later, it's the same 20 countries, but the threat is always growing. I call this the rule of 20. One of my other favorite terms is the word possession. There was legislation enacted in 1985 that made a condition for providing U.S. aid to Pakistan. And it said that we could provide foreign aid to Pakistan if Pakistan was found not to possess a nuclear explosive device, and the provision of aid would reduce the risk that they would possess that device. So this is Congress's effort to try to establish a norm. Well, this led to a great debate over what constitutes possession. If you have all the boxes and pieces and parts of a 1957 Chevy in your garage, but they're in boxes, do you have a 57 Chevy? Well, the State Department came up with this explanation that I can only describe as the Cirque du Soleil of legal verbiage. If you listen carefully, you'll hear 3 triple negatives in here. I mean, you'll hear a triple negative. The fact that a state does not have an assembled device would not necessarily mean that it does not possess a device under the statutory standard.
Can you say that again?
It translated into English, it means that a country can be found to possess a bomb if they have it in unassembled form. If they have everything for the bomb but just haven't turned the last screw on it, they can be found to possess and then be disqualified for the aid.
Can you just repeat that?
I'll read it one more time. It's 1987, State Department Office of Legal Affairs. The fact that a state does not have an assembled device would not necessarily mean that it does not possess a device under the statutory standard. I'm sorry, but in any statement about a few words on the bomb, I had to include this.
I know, that's good. It's good.
There's a raging debate in the U.S. also over what the difference is between non-proliferation and counter-proliferation. And if you're interested in that, you can have your own search, but basically you'll find out counter-proliferation is basically non-proliferation by military means. It means going in and blowing up places and seizing ships on the high seas and things like that, rather than just using export controls or sanctions. I learned an interesting, 2 other interesting phrases in the U.S. that stuck in my mind. One is when we were doing sanctions laws, we had to devise a way of drafting a sanctions law that it would not cover people who were innocent dupes who sold something abroad that helped another country to build a nuclear weapon, but were completely unaware of it. So we had to have a standard in law, it's called scienter, or knowledge. And my advisor with the Office of Legal Counsel suggested I use a phrase from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibited what was called, and again, this is a legal phrase I'm going to read you, head in the sand behavior. Now, head in the sand behavior is willful negligence. It means that it means you should have known, is what it means. And so anyway, we had this standard already in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, so we were able to use that at least as a legal standard for what constituted sufficient knowledge in order to make you culpable for an export control violation or a sanctionable offense. And I think one of the funniest phrases I covered in my years in the Senate was when the United States gets very upset with another country, it sends a diplomatic message called a démarche. And the démarche is supposed to signal the U.S. firm resolve, and it's usually done in a negative context. Well, we had a hearing once where Reagan administration official Richard Pearl, who was always worried that our demarches were too soft, they were not strict enough. He referred to these as the marshmallows. And so that's another gem in the golden book of words about the bomb. But again, that's one of those phrases also that took off. Now, my experiences in the UN are somewhat different because the UN is not just one arena, it's several arenas. You have the Secretariat, you've got the Secretary General, you've got the General Assembly, the Security Council, this body in Geneva that negotiates treaties, the Conference on Disarmament. And all through these institutions, there's a constant tug of war going on between what's called political will, having a sufficient coalition strength to do something, and what I call political won't, which is the desire to keep things pretty much as they are and not change things. Now, one of the things that struck me is about in the language that I've seen in the UN is the very, very frequent use of metaphors. When you have a UN conference that doesn't reach a consensus, or that you have deeply divided votes on a resolution or something, very often commentators will blame the UN. So the UN failed to do this, the UN failed to do that. The UN is a body that has states that come in and they meet, and when they reach agreement on it or a consensus, they can act. When there is big disagreements, what the UN is doing is it's essentially giving you an indicator of something. It's giving you the indicator of the level of agreement there is in the international society. If there is no agreement, the UN is telling you there's no agreement. Okay? So it's like a messenger. So I've often used the analogy of a thermometer and weather. I mean, blaming the UN for the failure of a diplomatic conference is a little like blaming a thermometer for hot weather. The UN is giving you information about the state of the world, and it tends to do so pretty accurately. Often that it is not news people want to hear. Another thing they do a lot in the UN is to develop yardsticks or measures for accountability or for reviewing behavior under a treaty. And however, these yardsticks are often subject to multiple interpretations. And so it occurred to me that, as any tailor knows, a really good tailor, that you can have the finest yardstick, but it's only as good as the vision and skills of the person using it that makes it useful. Yardsticks are easy to come up with about standards that should be met or goals that should be achieved, but generally, the more specific they are and the more time limited they are, the more reliable they are likely to be as instruments of accountability. We have this problem all the time of yardsticks being developed, but no real standards of how to achieve them. We have this architecture of machinery, we call it the UN Disarmament Machinery, which is designed to produce these norms. And in the year 2000, my former Secretary General Kofi Annan made a speech where he warned of rust in the machinery. And he said this was not due to the machinery itself, but it's due to the irregularity of its use and maintenance of the machinery. That in other words, he's bringing the responsibility back from the institution of the UN to the policies and priorities of the states. Now, the Brookings Institution had another metaphor that I think is just mind-boggling. They issued a study in 1999 that the United States had spent $5.6 trillion overall on nuclear weapons since in historic costs. And they realized that people don't understand what 5.6 trillion is. So they decided to give you a metaphor. If you made a pile of dollar bills, 5.6 trillion, it would go from this floor, one on top of the other, to the moon, and almost all the way back to Earth. If you put these dollar bills in bricks along the equator, it would go around the Earth 100 times and make a wall 8 feet tall. That's what $5.6 trillion is. So next time someone tells you that there's not a large cost or opportunity cost from all this investment in nuclear weapons, think about that metaphor. It's a very powerful one. Way back in 1955, it was none other than Don Hammarskjöld who used another metaphor referring to the United Nations, referring to disarmament at the United Nations as, in his words, again, back in that's over a half century ago, a hardy perennial. And that's the way it's been since. I remember last 2 weeks ago, I was on a ship in the Mediterranean deliberating a zone in the Middle East free of weapons of mass destruction, and I had a guy who just come from Fukushima and he presented to me a little doll this big, and it's called an Aizu doll. And the thing about this doll is you put it on the table and you bend it over, and it pops back up again. It refuses to stay down, it comes back up again. And he was saying that this is a story of the people who work in Fukushima. They were able to recover from these horrible things and come back. And it was also pointed out that this is also the kind of mentality that you need in the field of disarmament, because you're always being criticized as being utopian, unrealistic, and practical. I'll get to that later. And yet, it's interesting that remains still a top priority for many, many states, and certainly no question for the UN. There's also something that we've done, which is, we don't use this term, but basically you might think of it as counterpoint rhetoric, where you see terms that are very popular in the discourse on nuclear weapons. Like, for example, we have the nuclear weapons stewardship programs, which are taking care of nuclear weapons. Well, we thought we'd come up with disarmament stewardship. We have a group of institutions called the Nuclear Weapon Complex. Well, we point to the absence of a disarmament complex. Where are the companies and institutions and laws and regulations, and where are the agencies to do disarmament work? The lack of a disarmament complex. We heard of the revolution in military affairs involving the development of long-range, high-precise weapons. And yet there's no discussion of a revolution in disarmament affairs, which is using high technology to develop means of verification and rolling back and eliminating these weapons. We hear about sustainable development, but not sustainable disarmament. This theme of bringing the rule of law to disarmament is one of the things that we've been pushing quite aggressively. And I've alluded to it already in terms of bringing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty into force, negotiating a fissile material treaty, establishing universal membership on all these other agreements. But it's a powerful concept because no state on earth is opposed to the rule of law. And the idea of bringing legal structures and norms to disarmament is actually quite popular. And most recently, the growing in popularity has been the applicability of customary international law, including humanitarian law. The indiscriminate nature of nuclear weapons is giving rise to concerns over whether the use of these weapons is conceivable under international humanitarian law, which for 300-some years has prohibited the use of weapons that are inherently indiscriminate in their effects. Now, there is another vein of rhetoric that I see a lot in the UN, which is what I call the rhetoric of distraction and delay. This is otherwise might be known as the red herring rhetoric. It's interesting that Machiavelli did a twist on an old phrase that was originally written by Cicero called videre quam esse, which is to seem to be rather than to be. And I see this a lot in the attitudes toward nuclear disarmament. We see increasingly references to the need for conditions or preconditions for disarmament. And when you start looking at these lists of preconditions, you find on the list such things as world peace, end all regional disputes, solve all proliferation threats, end all terrorism, essentially solve all the goals of the UN Charter as a precondition for, then we'll talk about disarmament. That is not at all what the treaty law provides or what the rest of the world community is. But it's another thing is watch out for the phrase ultimate goal. If you look up the word ultimate in the dictionary, you'll find it magically has two definitions. One means most important objective, and the other definition means last to be achieved. And so this term has a lot of popularity at the UN because it means a lot to two different camps. They all agree that they want nuclear disarmament as an ultimate goal, but they mean entirely different things to these different groups. The Gang of Four, the Wall Street Journal op-eds, refer to disarmament as a vision or a misty mountaintop, they call it. You can't see the top of the mountain, but you know it's there and we need to keep working for it. Again, distant goal, not really practically achievable. It shifts the debate to, rather than to get rid of the nuclear weapons, it shifts the debate to stability at low numbers, quote unquote. All right, I could go, there's literally dozens of these things. I have to tell you that all the arguments against disarmament for the last 6 decades come down to 12. And they're really, I call them the dirty dozen, but I'll just go through them very, very quickly. 1, it's utopian and practical. 2, dangerous. 3, more urgent priorities exist. 4, irrelevant. 5, best seen only as an ultimate goal or vision. 6, that nukes are valuable in keeping the peace, sustaining order. 7, that it's unenforceable. 8, unverifiable. 9, would open the door to large-scale conventional war. 10, economics. Nuclear weapons are simply a cheaper way to prevent war than to rely on conventional arms alone. 11, nuclear weapons are only dangerous when they're in the wrong hands. And last, nuclear weapons can never be disinvented. Now, I challenge you, the next time you read an anti-disarmament article, I can guarantee you that you will find at least 80% of these arguments in that. They are recycled over and over and over again and have been since the 50s. Now, there's a number of other examples of intentional ambiguity. The phrase, in dealing with Iran, for example, we've seen a lot of references to the phrase, all options are on the table. No one seems to know what this means, other than it sounds very tough. Some thinks that it may mean including the use of nuclear weapons. Israel has a position also in this category that it will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Then there's what I call trapdoor rhetoric, which is the devil's in the details. Very often we have resolutions adopted in the General Assembly that promise and ask for very bold things, but then at the end it says there's a comma, and this little phrase says, within existing resources, which means we're not giving you any money to do this. So if you want to do it, you can do it, but you have to take it out of your own budget. Another phrase to watch out for is the phrase politically binding. In my view, binding means obligatory. Often in the UN, you hear the phrase politically binding means essentially nothing. It means that we agree to something so long as we feel like it. Tomorrow we may issue a press release, we may have a change of government, and it doesn't apply anymore. So that is another problem. Now, in writing these, my former boss from Sri Lanka warned me that I have a certain tendency to rely on the Western canon for my quotations that I use. And in fact, I have a whole shelf of quotation books, and it's uncanny how much of them rely on commentators from within the Atlantic area. And it's quite interesting because there's a book in South Asia called the Ramayana. It's an Italian epic, which makes the first reference to weapons of mass destruction. And this was done 2,300 years ago. And in this story, the king refuses to use a weapon that would annihilate an enemy because it violates the ancient in 2,300 years ago, rules of war. So we have the norm against using weapons of mass destruction going back thousands of years. And it's really quite interesting. And it's useful to you. It's especially useful when you consider that many of the speeches that we write and prepare are for international audiences. I mean, compare the audience you're dealing with when you're giving the Lalit Athumatudali Memorial Oration in Colombo, Sri Lanka, the Olaf Palme Memorial Lecture in Stockholm, the Casper, Wyoming Committee on Foreign Relations, the International Law Section of the American Bar Association, and the Risho Kosakai Buddhist Organization. Not to mention doing the opening statement for Secretary General at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Ceremony. These are all, unique audiences that you simply got to find out, what they are accustomed to hearing, what they expect to hear, and how you can use that to clarify what your own messages are. I'll skip on quickly here because I'm running out of time. I would like to say that both the Senate and the UN are best thought of as extremely complex political systems, complex in terms of actors and interests, and complex in the way the language is used. There are many elements of the struggle to establish norms that are similar in both institutions, as I've said. including many of the classical rhetorical tools of persuasion, reliance on pathos. The classic case here is the use of the hibakusha, the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the testimonies of their stories of how they personally coped with not just the explosions that took place in August of 1946, but all the decades of aftermath that they had to deal with, all the birth defects in the family, all the hardships, the discrimination within Japan that they had to face. They've got ethos, where you have people who have devoted their entire lives to working these causes, and great Nobel Peace Laureates, for example, and others who have come. You've got logos, which is the iteration of logical and clear, rational arguments. That all these correspond strikingly, I thought, my old graduate studies reminded me a lot of Max Weber's three types of authorities: traditional, charismatic, and legal rational. They're all useful in making appeals to persuade people of the need for urgent action in this field. I've often found that there's also a fine line between crafting initiatives to achieve ends, to achieve agreed ends, and actually creating the ends yourselves, or themselves, by clarifying them. The proper scope for compromise in this business, both in the Senate and I think in the UN, has been a reasonable debate over means, but a fixed agreement on the need not to change the ends. The ends have been agreed by years and years of hard work, and they have been widely reviewed as in the public interest. And this essentially brings me to where we are right now, and the ultimate common ground that is shared by the Senate. It is largely they are both institutions that are battling over how best to achieve agreed ends. And the greatest danger for me in both these institutions is when the ends themselves become questioned, and that we no longer talk about how can we achieve disarmament, but rather how can we live with nuclear weapons. And that is will be another era and another speech for another time. Thank you.